welcome to 7-Bit Pixel Tutorials, where we take some of the tools and techniques that seem to be your favourite online trends. I'm Taylor, and today we are looking at Alan Wake 2 by Remedy Entertainment. Alan Wake 2 is because of the Game of the Year 2023, and it's not hard to see why. Not only has it won a copious amount of awards and still being nominated, but it has tension-grabbing narrative, incredible art direction, and amazing sound design, all lending itself into a beautiful horrorscape. What better way than to use that to help us look at rope dynamics and even Insydium's Mesh Tools to create Saga's evidence board. We'll be looking at the dynamics of cloth simulations and rope dynamics within Cinema 4D to create the evidence board animation, and also looking at Insydium's Mesh Tools to find another way that isn't necessarily taxing but somewhat less dynamic. So without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so we're in a new Cinema 4D scene, and we're looking to create some rope dynamics for an evidence board. So if we go into here where our splines are and we go into Helix, we're able to start generating a spline, and this is the best way to get a straight line, funny enough. So if we go into here and we hit 0 on the start radius and 0 on the end radius, we've got a straight line, a perfectly straight line. Now our string is going to start off quite small, so I'm going to change the height down to 5 centimeters. Okay, so now we're working at a slightly small scale, but it's a slightly more real world scale. So I'm just going to move the plane across, so that we've got a slightly better view. Perfect, look at that, wonderful. So where do we go from here? So let's actually build some rope geometry. That'll probably be the best way to go about this. So if we go into here and we go sweep, and then we go back into here and we go end side. Now what the end side is, if I drop this down to say 2 centimeters, you can see that this is basically going to be the frame of our rope. So if I drag this into the sweep and I put the helix underneath, you can see that that has now basically generated our short little rope at the moment. So if I drop this down even further, let's say 0.5, we now have a little rope. Let's go into here, let's right click on the helix, simulation, rope, and hit play. It is a fully formed rope dynamic. Unfortunately, there's not much else going on and gravity causes it to fall out the scene. So let's fix that. Rope dynamics is all based on cloth simulation. So let's build what is effectively going to be controllers. So if we go into here and we go cube, and let's scale this cube down quite dramatically. And we want it slightly bigger than a rope, but we want it nice and thin. We don't want it to really get in the way at all. Perfect. So we go into our cube and we haven't got much geometry on it at all. And we want this rope to connect to this. So what's the best way to go about doing that? So if we go into here, cube, simulation, connector, this should start connecting, but it hasn't. And that's because, as I said, rope dynamics is based on cloth simulation. So we go into here, we go simulation, cloth. This now turns the whole thing into a cloth simulation. If we hit play, the whole thing falls down. So how do we fix that? So if we go into mix animation and we hit with pins, this effectively now turns our cube into a null object. It turns it into a controller. Now we have full control over how this end of the rope is going to look in a minute. So we go back to our connector tag, and we hit always draw, and we hit update live, and let's just drop this down to say like 0.5. So nothing's happened, and why is that? And that's because the search radius from here is looking for 0.5 here, but there's nothing for it to really connect to in the center. So if we go into our cube and we just add a bit of geometry, so now there's something for it to kind of look for in the center. We go back to our connector tag and let's just increase this. And then over time, you'll see that the rope is able to connect to the cube. Now if we hit play, the rope is controlled by this cube. Perfect. We have one end of the rope controlled, and we're now ready to start adding it to an evidence board, or even animating it in different ways that you'd want. So let's do one for the other side as well. So we're basically going to go into our cube, let's rename this, double click it and rename it controller. And we're just going to add a quick subdivision surface. If you hold Alt or Control as you click into it, it adds it on top and puts everything as a parent underneath. And we're just going to control click down the controller. We're going to move it over. We're going to press R for rotation, and we're going to click and hold Shift so we can get a full 180 on the Y-axis there. And then obviously the controller points are still looking at this side. So we need to go into controller 1, go into here, and all you got to do is just update this like that. Perfect. So if we go into play, we have 2 controller points holding it, but the gravity is still very, very strong. Now the problem with rope dynamics, and I'm not sure if there's a way to fix this, and if there is, please leave it in the comments and let me know. But when gravity is on, the rope will continue to sag. There's no way to kind of control it from my understanding. So the best outcome that you can get from this is if we press Control D or Command D, we go into our scene settings and we turn the gravity off. Now if we hit play, the rope is effectively just trying to interact with itself. Brilliant. We now have a form of rope dynamic that we're looking to use. So I'm just going to extend this out by another 2 seconds. We're using 30 frames here. I'll go back to the start, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to get this controller and I'm just going to animate it by clicking all 3 here, and I'm going to go maybe 90 seconds in, and I'm just going to move it maybe back here, something like that. And then what I'm also going to do with the rotation is I'm going to come back here, keyframe on the rotation, 90 frames, and I'm just going to rotate it a little bit just so that we have something a little bit more dynamic as it moves. But you can already see that the cloth simulation is trying to calculate that movement. So if we go back to the beginning and we press play, you can already see that it's all trying to move. So you can start seeing how we're going to get this to animate from an original point to another, very much like in my Alan Wake piece. The first rope that comes from the confidential board is rope dynamic. So how else do we control this? What else can we do? So if we add a board, for example, let's just put a plane down, and this is our board. We go to the asset browser, and in stationery, in models, you've got a thumbtack. So let's get a thumbtack. So from here, again, R, shift click on the axis, so we can rotate it on the x-axis to get it like this. And all we need to do is parent this into our controller here, so that wherever this controller goes, the thumbtack now goes. And it looks like the rope is connected to the thumbtack. So if we come back to the beginning again, we're going to control click down the thumbtack, put this one in controller 1, and we're going to move this over, so that these pins are just on the outside of these bits of rope, so that it looks like it's pinned through the rope. So now on 90 frames, I want to reanimate where this is looking. So if I bring this back to -118, 0, 0, and I bring this back out to, let's say 0. Let's go 0 there as well, just so we can get a little bit more control. Perfect. So now this is going to move from here to here and look like it's been pinned in the board. I'm just going to add a few materials just so that we're not going to get confused over what we're looking at. Okay, and what I'm going to do in the end side, I'm just going to knock this down further just so that it kind of fits in scale roughly with our thumbtacks. Brilliant. So we want to hide these controllers, but we don't want to hide the thumbtacks, because if we go into here and we alt click, it will do both traffic lights at the same time. The top one's viewpoint, bottom one's render view. It hides them both. If we go into our render view, all of a sudden, we've lost our controller and our point. So what we want to do is, in our thumbtack here, we just want to mark these as green, so that it's permanently going to hide the controller, but it will always turn on the thumbtack. So we're going to do the same thing up here. And now we have our ropes. Brilliant. So that's all we wanted. So I'm just going to turn the reflectivity down of our background there. So that's what we want. I'm just going to move this back a little bit. So if I now go into our plane and I go Simulation Collider, and let's see what this does. So as you can see, there's a slight issue here. It's gone all the way through the back of the plane. And why is that? And that's because the collider tag on the rope here is set to front. And obviously the normals are facing back that way. So press R and we rotate this plane 180 degrees. We press play again. And already we're getting some form of interaction. Now, as you saw, it doesn't quite look great. What was all that bit at the beginning? Let's try and make it a little bit more obvious. So as we maybe go 30 seconds in, we're going to drag the controller and we're going to pull it out a little bit. I'm just going to put a keyframe there. So now the pin will come away from the board and pin itself back in. If we have a look, as you can see, it all kind of crumps up here, and it's not really what we're looking for, but it does organically. We increase the frame range, start interacting back with the wall, and resets itself in a really nice place. So that's actually looking really good, and very much like in my Alan Wake video, if the camera's moving quickly and effectively all the time, you're able to hide a lot of those issues. So you can already start seeing how this will look and the effects of this. Now we've looked at the basics of rope dynamics within Cinema 4D, let's go to look at how we can use Insydium's Mesh Tools. So we have controller 1 and controller 2, and they're pre-animated and they're going to move like that. So we want to generate a spline that will activate between these two things. So if we go to Insydium, if you have Insydium Mesh Tools, and we go Mesh Tools, and we go SplineFX, and you start seeing how this workflow was so much easier to generate the entire evidence board over time and grow them over time. So if we go to objects, and you can see we've got a bunch of parameters here, but it's actually fairly straightforward. So if we go to thumbtack 1 and we drag this into the start object, and we go thumbtack 2 and drag this into the end objects here, you can already see that we have a spline from one point to the other. So let's try and work out what is actually happening here. So if we change this to points, you'll find that all the points within our nulls of our thumbtacks are being used to connect from one to the other. And this is great if you've got visualizations or audio visualizations or kind of effects that require people to be disintegrate, that kind of stuff. It's amazing, but it's not for our purposes right now. If we go to surface, it happens a similar thing. It bases it on the surface of the object between the two start object and the end object. And you could change the surface points. So this would be good for electric shocks, static shocks, all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to go back to origin, and that will do the 2 points here, and that's kind of where we want the rope to be anyway. If we go down into connections limit, so this is, I can explain this brilliantly if I bring in another object. So let's bring in another cube. Let's bring this down to a really small size and put that over here. So if I go into here and add another end object, it's going to the first, the connections limit is to the first. If I change that to none, it will find connections to both of them. And the hierarchy is from bottom up. If I go back to connections limit first, it will start looking for that. If I turn that off, it goes back to the thumbtack. So because we're only looking between the two, we can just leave it on first. However, later on in the Alan Wake example that I created, I did manipulate between the connections limits. So we delete the cube and we go back to here. So it's scraggly because we've got noise. So if I press play, you can see this spline is reacting because there's a noise behind it causing motion, as if something is maybe blowing around it, that kind of stuff, wind. For the purposes of this tutorial, I'm just going to change these to 0. However, I would advise you to play and learn these different noise types and see what large noise and small noise do. So I'm going to change the amplitude on both to 0. And as you can see now, we have a straight line between the two. Lovely. Growth. So we're going to growth. This is fairly straightforward. We can grow the line from one point to the other, as you'll be able to see in my example. And there's a variation in that growth as well. So if we go to gravity, this is where it gets quite fun. We can increase the gravity, and already we have a rope that's looking slightly more slack. So we can add a keyframe here, and then as it gets to maybe frame 45, we can have the strength of the gravity go up, as if it's bending and extending with the thing, with the thumbtack. We can add a slight variation to it. We can change the bias about where the gravity is from object to object. And then we can add variation based on that bias as well. And then as we get to frame 90 again, we can maybe just bring that gravity in a little bit as if the strings got tauter. So now if we press play, and already with just 2 keyframes, obviously you adjust that over time, but you can start seeing the effect that we're trying to create. Avoid. This is fairly straightforward. If you have multiple objects and you want the spline to get from one to the other, you'll add objects into the avoid objects here, and the spline will work its way from the start object to the end object whilst avoiding the objects that you have told it to. And spline, this is effectively how you want the spline to look. So if we bring all the points down, it doesn't bend at all. And then obviously 3 points is 1, 2, 3. And so there's a bend in the middle. So we're just going to knock that back up to like 12. I like using Akima or Bezier spline, so I'm going to go Akima. It's slightly more smooth for me, and I'm just going to leave it on natural, but you have the same spline parameters here that you would do anyway. In connections, you can add forks, as if you're making lightning, and already you can see it's all forking off. And you could also do nearest distance, but we don't have enough objects right now to demonstrate that. So now we need to turn it into geometry. So if we go up to Insydium, and we go Xparticles, Generators, xpSplineMesher. So we bring it in and nothing happens. So how do we fix that? So if we scroll down in my parameters here, we got spline objects. So if we bring our Mesh Tools SplineFX into here, you're starting to see that we're generating what is effectively the sweep from the Cinema 4D native one. So if I bring this size down, let's say 0.1, now we have what is already looking like a string. So let's maybe bring this down again to maybe 0.08. And it's completely dynamic. It's fully updated. There's no delay in anything because we're not calculating any simulations. We effectively just have a spline that we've got animations on, and then we're just adding mesh to it. There's loads of different parameters here. You can even subdivide it. You can change the caps, you can change the joins. There's plenty of things you can do with this geometry. And then if we just add the red to it, already we have the red string from side to side. We go back into here, we make sure we can see our plane. And already we have a really nice, somewhat interesting rope dynamic tutorial, which allows you to create your evidence board like I did for my Alan Wake video. I hope this has been really informative. Like I said, if you found a way to stop the rope dynamics completely falling and overstretching with gravity turned on in Cinema 4D, please let me know. I'd love to find out. And if you have any suggestions for any tutorials going forward, do let me know. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate the support, and see you again next time.